Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Local Government Insights Podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership, your source and insight for local government technology. My name is Brendan Middleton, and today we have with us Robert Pesapane from FEMA to discuss the importance for local leaders to have a disaster financial plan before an emergency happens and the steps to take in preparing one. Welcome to the show, Robert. It's great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad to have this opportunity to meet with you today and talk about insights from FEMA.
Awesome. So really quick before we jump right to the first question I have for you, Robert. For those listening, Robert is an emergency management professional with over 10 years of state and federal government experience. He currently serves as the director of the Recovery Division for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Federal Emergency Management Agency, i.e., all of us know FEMA, where he is responsible for providing guidance, leadership, and oversight to state and local governments in an effort to help them recover from all disasters. Robert joins us today to discuss the importance of having a disaster financial plan before an emergency happens and the steps to take in preparing one. So, Robert, if we could just dive right in. First one I have, just to kind of set the stage. Local jurisdictions face many different types of emergencies. And what comes to mind quickly for most are tornadoes, fires, hurricanes. First off, what other types of emergencies have you dealt with?
Great question. So I think also routinely we see a lot of flood emergencies throughout the country. And so that's probably the number one risk that communities face is flooding. But also in FEMA Region 9, where I'm located here in Oakland, California, as you mentioned, we see a lot of fire risk related to wildland fire. And also in the far western Pacific, we have typhoons that hit our U.S. territories. And then even in Hawaii, volcanic risk in 2018, we had a significant volcanic eruption in Hawaii County. So there's a myriad of risk that local communities face. And it's important really to understand the risk profile that a community faces. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Most notably is working with your local emergency manager who understands the hazards that community faces through a deliberate planning process.
Excellent. And as a disaster occurs, like we all typically hear on the news, that federal funds are being provided. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, that process. How do federal grants play a role in disaster recovery? And kind of second part, I'd be curious to know, how does a jurisdiction access those funds and how long does it typically take? Can you talk about that process just a little bit?
Right. Well, it depends on the severity of the event. And so when FEMA is engaged, it's a presidentially declared disaster. And so the president's declared it a major disaster declaration for that state and community. And so we get engaged through that process. And that's a process that the governor requests through the president. Once that major disaster is granted, our FEMA recovery programs really kick in, and the one that most communities have experience with if they've dealt with FEMA is the Public Assistance Program. And that is our grant program where we're reimbursing damages to state, county, local governmental organizations, private nonprofits, and that assistance starts really immediately available. And we go through a process where one requests public assistance support, and we go through the state to work those damages and come up with what we call project worksheets and do reimbursement. And that's the FEMA process. But as we know, depending on the severity of the event that community may face, there could be other federal grant programs available, and the timeline for those grants are different. And that's where really a county or local government really needs to understand what's out there, and part of it is understanding what the recovery outcomes are and what their needs are. And so not all the programs start the moment a disaster occurs. Some of the other federal programs are appropriate funds from Congress, and so they may come at different times, unlike the FEMA funds are authorized the moment that the president declares a major disaster.
And when we start talking about recovery outcomes, Robert, can you talk a little bit about your experience specifically that may help some of those on the line today, in working with local communities to determine these types of recovery outcomes? How should they approach that, and what level does it start?
So, we say that all recovery and all disasters are at the local level because it affects their community. And it's important that the that they work together to understand what the impacts that their community has faced and where they want to see their community go in terms of recovery. And that happens, we like to have recovery conversations prior to the event, but we know many communities face a lot of different challenges on a day-to-day basis. So the first time they're dealing with an emergency when it happens. And the recovery process really needs to start from the moment that disaster or emergency occurs at the local community, because time is valuable and you can't get that time back. And so we'll work with communities on the response, which is very important to save lives and protect property. But then there needs to be a concerted effort to understand what that recovery looks like for that community, and that's really difficult. And so it requires a multitude of partners and stakeholders to come together fairly quickly with some dynamic leadership to start mapping out what those recovery outcomes could be. It could be housing, it could be infrastructure, it could be, depending on the devastation in the community, where a large part of a housing stock or infrastructure destroyed. What do you want that to look like? And as you start figuring that out, then the conversation comes is, how do we fund that? Right? Is it some rebuilding funds that FEMA may have authorized? Is it where we need, if I'm in a rural community, maybe there's USDA funds available, or Farm Service Agency if I'm in that rural community. And so there's a multitude of federal programs out there, and then the community really needs to start mapping out how they want to fund that, and that's very difficult. But to overcome that is, if you have a dynamic team with different levels of skills and experience, that's when the community can start really forming its team and start driving towards its recovery outcomes.
And it really starts with preparation. And if we could take a step back, if you wouldn't mind, for a few moments, I'd love to talk about prior to a disaster actually taking place and all of the different options and the recovery outcomes that you just described. Would you spend just a minute talking about, how does disaster financial management play a role in planning and preparation for these types of events?
Great question. So I think it plays a critical role. And so most communities have, I would imagine, a process where they're looking at the response plans, whether depending on their hazard. So if I have a flood risk, I'm sure the community is working on its flood hazard plan. If my community has a fire risk, I'm working on my evacuation routes. And so we have those deliberate processes in place because, again, we want to save lives and protect property. But then when a disaster happens, then we have to start focusing on what those recovery plans are, and ideally that starts in the preparedness phase. And so as we're working on those response plans, we need to be equally focused on what the recovery plans are. And one of the aspects to those recovery plans is disaster financial management, because that's going to be critical, as I mentioned, to supporting the recovery outcomes. And so I think spending time to formulate in a deliberate plan what my recovery team looks like, who's on my team, roles and responsibilities of the team, and then what are the gaps that I may have in my team that I may have to identify after the fact, either through mutual aid with another community that's gone through a disaster that I want to bring in those experts, or I might need voluntary agency support for the long term, or I might need to get specialized experience to come in and help me navigate through my recovery. And so spending some time before disaster just to talk about these key concepts, to make sure that all leaders in local and county government understand that, I think is time well spent that will provide, will save time when the disaster happens. And it's all about saving time and moving through the recovery spectrum as fast as possible.
Excellent. And given the fact that a jurisdiction may realize that they need this sort of disaster financial management plan, if you will, one layer deeper, what if they realize they need it? What does a jurisdiction sort of need to have in order to incorporate the plan, like actually take action and develop the plan before emergency happens? So we realize this is possible. We all acknowledge these are regular occurrences. They're happening more frequently, as we all know, across the country and across the world. We need to do this. We have this plan that we need to develop. How do they go about doing that, and what do they need to do in order to incorporate a plan?
Great. Well, I think we have a lot of best practices out there, and a lot of unfortunate communities have gone through recovery and then either developed plans prior to or had to develop recovery plans afterwards. And so I think the first starting point is to, go through one's network to understand what work has been done. And so FEMA is a great resource. State emergency management, county emergency management may already have recovery frameworks in underway or already done. And so I think going through those organizations, having a relationship with the local state emergency management organization is critical because they may have already a framework and concepts underway, and also can provide technical expertise in the formation of a local recovery plan. So I would say that's the starting point. I also think getting a strong mandate from local elected or appointed leaders to say that this is a priority for our community. And so coming up with a charter and framework that empowers this recovery team identified, I think will also be critical and set up a framework for them to effectuate the recovery plan.
And I want to touch on one of those key points, Robert, if you don't mind. Just talk about the team itself. You mentioned a disaster financial team. What does that team assist with, and like who is it comprised of? What are the stakeholders there?
So I think what we envision on this team. Again, I think you might have emergency management partners, but I think it's the partners that we often don't think of that we need on this team, and so that's the local financial management coordinator or fiscal agent for that community, somebody who understands disaster or contracting in general, maybe even somebody from payroll who understands the pay policies and how they're affected in disasters. And so it's more than just the first responders who may make up the immediate recovery plan, but it's the larger role that other services play within the community on the finance side that need to be brought to the table, because they have an integral part. Also could be legal counsel, and so there are different laws and procedures that may be in effect in a locally declared disaster. And so I think having a good the legal team as part of that plan, I think, is also critical.
And in addition to the team, the skill sets on that team clearly are very important as well. And you mentioned it in your earlier response when I was talking about sort of what do they need to have in order to sort of create the plan. And you mentioned project and portfolio management skills. Why are those particular skills so critical, and something you really don't think about when you're pulling together sort of a preparedness team like this? Like, what skills, we know the stakeholders, right? You just identified them. Why are the project and sort of portfolio management skills probably more critical than any?
Well, we know recovery is long term, and so we're and recovery can be measured in months to years, depending on the severity of the event. And so having project managers and portfolio specialists in certain areas, I think, is going to be critical. Again, driving to those recovery outcomes. And so, since recovery for a community takes so long, it's important to map out project by project, what we need for infrastructure, for housing, and having specialists in those areas that can also understand federal funding and grants, I think, will be critical. And so, you want to make sure you have a diverse team that covers a wide-ranging skills that make up really your community, and make sure that they're at the table, they have a seat at the table for that. And so, I think the portfolio management, again, is one of those key areas that you would want on your overall recovery team, because you're going to be managing a number of funding streams and a number of projects, and you want a holistic recovery outcome at the end of the day. And so I think it's important to have individuals who can map that out for you and put it on a project timeline. So making sure that the entire team's on track for achieving those recovery outcomes.
Fantastic. And obviously, once a disaster occurs, it seems like oftentimes we sort of, okay, what's next, and how do I sort of execute on next steps? Like, could you spend just a minute talking about like how jurisdictions can increase their knowledge of the procurement and the sort of the contracting practices that obviously occur once these disasters take place? Like, what are those procurement and contracting practices that our audience should be made aware of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, I think what happens in my experience after a disaster happens is that a lot of communities get paralyzed, or they start doing things that are outside their legal authority. And so one of those areas is contracting. Just because a disaster happens in that community doesn't mean that the rules and regulations at the local, county, or state government do not exist. And so I think it's important to again, in the preparedness phase, understand uh, are there different authorities to contract at the local level. And what we do at FEMA is we look at those procurements that are doing disaster contracting, and we want to ensure that they're following their local rules for contracting. And then for federal reimbursement, there are some things to look at. 2 CFR 200 in particular is one of those areas that we look at to make sure that the federal procurement rules and regulations are in there in terms of disaster contracting. And we have resources available, advanced disaster assistance procurement teams, PDAT teams that can be made available through state partners to come to the community to do some training ahead of time, or when the disaster happens, provide that just-in-time training to the community to ensure that, again, what they're doing is going to be sufficient for federal reimbursement. And that may again be applicable not just to FEMA, but to any federal funding resource that the community is going after, to make sure that they're following those rules correctly. Again, one of the big mistakes that we see is community that doesn't have a sole source contracting ability to do a sole source, or they're entering into unreasonable cost because they didn't solicit a number of didn't do request for proposal and RFP and go through a competitive bid process, and then we find those costs potentially unreasonable. And so I think it really spending some time on the preparedness phase to understand are there different rules on a locally declared or state declared disaster, and what those rules are, and then making sure those department heads who are making those contract decisions, whether it's the first responder community or public works, that what they're doing is legally sufficient and have the documentation to support the action that they're taking at the time that they're doing it.
It's incredible advice. So in wrapping up today, Robert, would you mind just providing any key takeaways for those that are listening today? I know we talked about the types, we talked about the preparedness, and we talked about the team and sort of the execution and some of the best practices that you should be made aware of prior to something like that, like this happening. But what would be other key takeaways, if any, for our listeners today?
I think it's just really to take action, right? I think you have to recognize again that most of our communities are in a hazard threat area. Again, whether that's wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, typhoons, and in some circumstances it's volcanic. There's a lot of hazards out there, and most communities have a variety of hazards. So understand the hazard and the risks that your community face, putting a plan together to mitigate the effects of those hazards within the community, and really start formulating plans. And it's always better to do that before the disaster. Very difficult for a local community to start thinking about the recovery when they have to respond to the actual event and then come up with a recovery plan. And so we're encouraging communities to really spend some time before disaster happens to start thinking about these things, to formulate their teams, to get some training, and understand their gaps. So when they have a plan, when they understand their gaps, they can institute their plans right away. I also, want to mention that there are a number of resources out there, again, that exist at the, in emergency management at the county, state level, but also at FEMA. We have a number of disaster financial management resources. We have a disaster financial management guide. We also have one for COVID-19 recovery. We have grants management capacity. We have procurement disaster assistance teams. And then we periodically offer technical assistance resources to communities in regards to these areas I've mentioned. And so again, there are resources out there. I would encourage communities to take advantage of those resources, outreach to other communities that they know of that experience disasters, learn from what has happened with those communities. A lot of communities develop after action reports and lessons learned from devastating events. I think it's important that as a community of practice that we learn from other communities that were impacted, and so we don't make the same mistakes again. And it's been my experience that those communities that unfortunately have gone through a significant event are more than willing to spend time with other governments to explain their process and what they've done, and there are amazing best practices out there for communities that they can take advantage of. So they're not starting with nothing. There is work that's been done out there, and so I think I would encourage community members to take advantage of that. And then again, I think one other thing I would mention just in terms of preparedness is we're talking about local government preparedness, but I think again even local government employees can be impacted by disaster, right? And so also making sure there are programs and initiatives to have those essential workers come back and how what's their family preparedness and making sure they're taking appropriate actions. Part of that is if you want those people at the table at the time of disaster, you have to communicate to let them know that they're part of the team and what their expectations are, so they can make preparations if they themselves are impacted by the disaster.
That's great. That's great. And thanks for sharing those resources. And we'll have a link to those resources that Robert specifically mentioned down in the comments of this video that you can access anytime. And if you do have any other questions for Robert after this conversation today, we'd be happy to connect and help educate and get some answers to those comments or questions that you may have. Well, honestly, Robert, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate you jumping on today. Thanks for your time. This is a really important topic. We've talked about similar topics on this show exactly, whether it be cybersecurity or natural disaster preparedness and planning. Prepare or recovery actually starts before they take place. So I appreciate you driving that home today. Thanks for all of your insight. For our listeners, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Local Government Insights podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership. Stay tuned for more local government news and insights to come. We look forward to having you join us next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.